Welcome to the future. We started this forum off looking back to World War I, 100 years, spent the next day plus thinking about the world's problems today. And to close off, we're going to do a little bit of whimsy here, really kind of peering into the crystal ball and seeing where we're headed. I'm Matt Kaminski. I'm the co-founder of Politico Europe and the global editor of Politico. I want to introduce this fantastic panel, starting with Nick Burns, who had a long career in American diplomacy as ambassador to Greece and NATO, and is currently a professor at Harvard and the director of the Future of Diplomacy project there. Pastor Esther Ibanga from Nigeria, who runs the Women Without Walls initiative, had a career in business before, I think, becoming the first female pastor in Jos, in central Nigeria. Vladimir Kara-Murza is the vice chairman of Open Russia, and I'd met him as a colleague of the late Boris Nemtsov. Interesting. We're really happy to have you here, especially since you have been twice poisoned, both in 2015 and 2017. And it's great to see you in such good.
I'm very happy to be here as well.
Good form.
It's a safe place.
And we have retired General Amos Yadlin, who's had a 40-year career in the IDF and now heads up a think tank in Tel Aviv, worked in defense intelligence, and was interesting to read your bio that you were part of the mission in 1981 to destroy the Osherak nuclear reactor. If we're all going to close our eyes a little bit, I'm going to ask my panel to close their eyes and maybe start with Nick. Nick, imagine for us American power 10 years from now.
Okay, just a small question to get us started.
Just started off light, yeah.
In 90 seconds or less, I'll be happy to do it. First of all, let me say I'm very happy to be here in Halifax. This is a great conference, and I've learned a lot. So thank you to the organizers. Maybe just 2 points, Matt, to start off with as an American thinking about our future. Number one, I think post-Trump, because I don't think President Trump, frankly, is capable of this, we're going to need American leaders who understand that most of the major challenges that we all face in 195 nation states, 7.6 billion people, are transnational. That we've got to be looking out and working across national borders. That's not the president's philosophy now, but it was what George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama all believed. So whether it's on climate change, trafficking of women and children, crime cartels, drug cartels, what do we do to prepare for pandemics? Because we know we've experienced them. We were able to contain a pandemic in West Africa with the help of Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea. We may not get as lucky the next time. How do we organize the world to defend against the major global challenges? We're going to have to create coalitions with the North Americans working with the Africans and the Europeans and Asians and others. And right now, that's a fitful process if the number one economy and the world's strongest military power is looking inward. So I think that's a big challenge for Americans in the future, is to understand that our self-interest dictates that we look outward. That's the defensive side. But in government, we also have to we have to advance human values. And we can do great things to continue some of the positive global trend lines. Major inroads on global poverty the last 30 years, everybody knows that. Major positive inroads on global public health, from polio near eradication to malaria, perhaps eradicated in our lifetime. So how can we use the energy of governments and coalitions to defend against the worst aspects of climate, but to advance on the most important human values? I think that's number one for the Americans to think about. Number two, and this is very much, I'm a former ambassador to NATO, very much a NATO issue. How do we contain Putin in Eastern Europe? And I think he's probably president for life. And how do we do that in a way that we avoid the catastrophic conflict that we've worried about since the end of the Second World War? So a resurgence of NATO and a rebuilding of NATO's both spirit and confidence, but also our military ability. And then in the East, I think probably the biggest American challenge. How do we balance the fact that we're partners with China, climate change, managing the global economy, but we're clearly competing with them for military positioning and military power? And this gets to our East Asian alliance with Japan, South Korea, Australia, our defense partnerships with New Zealand and the Philippines, Thailand, India, Sri Lanka, Singapore. I'm worried that we're out of balance right now. The entire American political system is now, and I think agrees with Vice President Pence's speech, that we are in strategic competition. And I think we need to compete with the Chinese. But there are parts of our agenda where we have to have partnership with them. How do you keep that in balance? And we'll be competing. It's going to be a battle of ideas 10 years from now and the next 10 years. The democratic societies standing up for our way of life, both in Europe and in Asia. The authoritarian societies, people like Xi Jinping, Putin, MBS, Erdogan saying that an autocratic way is the way forward. We have to have the self-confidence. I think Halifax is all about this, that the democratic way forward is the way. So those are just a couple of thoughts as to how Americans need to think about our responsibilities in the next decade.
How confident are you that the U.S. will be number one militarily and I guess politically, economically, in 10 years? And what is the key to getting to, is it technological? Is it Asia? Is it diplomacy? You sort of went through some of those things, obviously.
You know, whether or not the Chinese pass us in nominal GDP, and they may very well in the next 10 to 15 years, look at the differences in per capita income, look at the differences in innovation economically. I have no doubt that North America, Western Europe will still be the single most important economic part of the world. We're the two largest economies. The North American economies and the EU are the two largest economies in the world. That's why free trade agreements. I never thought NAFTA needed to be deconstructed and renamed. I think that relationship among the three of us is absolutely essential to the United States. Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We ought to have a free trade agreement between North America, NAFTA, and the EU. That would be a powerful, powerful voice for free trade. But everything is going to depend on the second question you asked. Who wins the battle of technology? Because we're entering in the digital age an extraordinary technological race in AI, in quantum computing, in aspects of biotechnology. They're all going to be militarized, as technologies always are. The Chinese now have a strategy. It's well funded. Of course, anything developed in a Chinese lab automatically is extended to the PLA. That's not the case, as General Dunford said yesterday, with the American tech companies and Washington. So we need a purposeful national strategy in the United States, working with our allies in Canada and the European allies in NATO to compete with the Chinese and not be dominated technologically 10 years from now, because that actually could happen if we're not purposeful.
To come back to that, but let me turn to Esther, who's from the fastest growing continent in the world, at the both in terms of population and the economy. And I've heard Nigeria described as the China of Africa, so the most dynamic country there. Imagine a little about sort of Africa, your country, looking forward. What gives you hope? What gives you cause for concern?
Thank you so much to the organizers for having us here. It's always been an enriching experience. So talking about Africa, I have to start from Rwanda. And I have to start from Never Again, when it happened 5 years ago. Unfortunately, I can't say that that has been true for the rest of Africa, because we have seen consistent repetition of ethnic and religious violence, destroying basically, the whole of Africa and stunting her growth and potentials. And I always feel that Africa is better than that. 10 years from now, I hope we won't be talking about that. The reason I say this is because it's really unfortunate what happened to Jamal Khashoggi and the public uproar that went over his unfortunate death. But in Africa, in Nigeria, and especially in the Middle Belt, we're still having cases like that almost on a daily basis. And the international community never gets to hear about it. An example is on the 23rd and 24th of June this year in my state, 223 people were killed in one day. Nobody heard anything about it. And it's happening, the whole of the Middle Belt. on a constant crisis, a constant ethnic cleansing, the killings, the conflicts that are going on, is persistent. And even though many people would like to term it a religious conflict, it's actually political. So 10 years from now, I really hope I won't be talking about this again. That's my prayer. That's my heart for Africa. We're better than this. We could, you know, it's time we go way past the issues of ethnicity and religion and killing of each other, or allowing politicians to use the tool of religion to divide and rule. 10 years from now, I'm also hoping that the true leaders of Africa will show up. Leaders that are competent, leaders that have the capacity, leaders that have character, that are interested in the welfare of the people, and are ready to serve, not to be there for their own personal interests. I think we have a great potential, and 10 years from now, I want to begin to see the manifestation of those potentials.
Vladimir, assuming Putin is mortal, how do you picture Russia going forward? Or do you see various scenarios that it could turn out?
Thank you, Matt. I want to thank the Halifax International Security Forum for having us here and for organizing this discussion. I think I may have perhaps the most improbable task of any of the panelists, because the one thing that we do know about the modern political history of Russia is how unpredictable it is and how sharp of a turn it can make here and there. And those people who say today that Putin's regime is stable, that it's invincible, that it's entrenched, that it's going to be there for a long, long time, I think would really benefit from looking at some of the big turns that Russian history has made, let's say over the past century or so. I doubt, for example, that the Tsarist interior minister, Vyacheslav von Plehve, when he boasted in 1904 about a small victorious war that was supposed to solve all the domestic problems, that was a war against Japan, I doubt that he expected that just a year later, Russia would be engulfed in a revolution and the Tsar would be forced to concede a parliament and civic freedoms. I doubt that Lenin, when he gave his famous speech in Zurich in January of 1917 to the Swiss Young Social Democrats, in which he told them that we old folks will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution, I don't think he expected that the Tsar would abdicate 6 weeks later and a revolution would begin. And I'm old enough myself to remember that nobody at the beginning of August of 1991, nobody predicted that by the end of the month, the Soviet system would no longer exist, and that by the end of the year, neither would the Soviet Union itself. So let's take with a pinch of salt all those predictions and analyses that Putin's there for a long time, that he's there forever. Ambassador Burns just said that he is likely going to be ruler for life. He certainly wants to be ruler for life. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It doesn't mean he will be. Because if it was, if it was only up to dictators to stay in power forever, then all of them would stay in power forever, all the time, in every country of the world. And obviously we know that's not what is happening. As my good friend Boris Vishnevsky likes to say, he's a rarity in today's Russia. He's an opposition legislator. He's a member of the Legislative Assembly in St. Petersburg for Yabloko, it's a liberal opposition party. As he likes to remind people, Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian communist dictator, had 99% approval 2 weeks before his overthrow. And I always thought this was just like a grand-sounding phrase. I would still repeat it even if it were, but I actually went and fact-checked it, and it's actually true. And so I think when we speak about Russia in 10 years, it's pretty safe to say it's going to look very, very different from what it is today. And I think a very big warning sign for Mr. Putin's regime were the nationwide protests that took place all over Russia in these past 18 months or so, when we saw tens of thousands of people go to the streets all across the country, from the Baltic to the Pacific, to speak out and to protest against corruption, against the abuse of power, against the lack of accountability, and at the end of the day, against the sheer fact that one individual has now stayed in power for nearly 2 decades, a lifespan of a generation. And I think that the particular warning sign for the Kremlin was that so many, in fact, the vast majority of those protesters were young people. It was a generation that grew up, and was in many cases born under Vladimir Putin. So for many of these people, they have no other political memories. They remember no other political realities. All they have seen is that one face on their television screens in their entire lives. And yet it is that generation, the university and high school students, who are increasingly saying enough, and who are increasingly having the tenacity and the courage to go out and publicly say it, despite the intimidation, despite the pressure, despite everything that can await opposition activists in Russia today. And I think that, and especially the demographics of those protests, is a very, as I said, a very worrying sign for the Putin regime, but I think it's a very hopeful sign for the future of Russia.
We'll leave the easiest for last. Let's imagine the Middle East in terms of borders, in terms of leaders, in terms of alliances. Based on what's happening now, where are we going in your part of the world?
I was not planned to be on this panel. And then I was approached to join since I came from the Holy Land when there were a lot of prophets. Unfortunately, according to the Jewish and the Christian belief, the last prophet was seen 2,000 years ago, and according to my friends who are Muslims, 1,400 years ago.
So we're overdue.
So no prophets arrived. And it is going to be very difficult to look into the future. And I was also in the Kennedy School as a student. And John Nye taught me that trying to predict the future is not useful. What you should do is paint scenarios and craft a policy that will try to advance the best scenario. Mm-hmm. So what are the scenarios for the Middle East? Maybe the most likely is more of the same, unfortunately. Continuation of the main confrontation today between the Sunni and the Shia. It's not between democracy and totalitarianism. It's two kinds of very problematic regimes. And when the Arab Spring started, I say with all due respect to Saudi Arabia and Egypt, you have to look to two countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia. As long as the change is not there, change for freedom, for democracy, for human rights, we are going to stay in the same problematic Middle East. There is another scenario of stabilization, because the Middle East, after 7 years of very tough civil war, is tired. And we may see that some of the conflict going towards a better resolution. Not a final and permanent resolution, but the war in Yemen may finish if the Americans will push MBS a little bit more. The war in Syria may finish if the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians and the Israelis and the Americans will help it to at least don't go to the same atrocity. And I fully agree that with all the respect to the journalist that was killed in the embassy or at the consulate in Istanbul, there are 500,000 Syrians that were killed, and the world basically looked to the other way. They were killed by Kalashnikovs, by rocket, by mortars, with sarin gas, with starvation. And so the Middle East is really a problematic place, but people are now looking for stabilization. It will not solve the problem. There is another problematic scenario, and this is domination. Domination of Iran, domination of Russia, and maybe the combination of both, because the West lost interest. There is more oil in the US than in Saudi Arabia. After two very unsuccessful wars, both Obama and Trump don't want to go to any operation in the Middle East. So Iran is now controlling 4 Arab countries, Arab capital, not fully occupying, but have a lot of influence. This is Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a. And Iran has patience, This is a civilization that's not looking for the 6 o'clock news or the next quarter. They are planning half a generation ahead. And they are trying to entrench militarily in Syria, have this land bridge that go from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon. So domination of Iran is a scenario. We will do everything that it will not happen. But Israel may be left alone on this job because America is not interested, Europe is not interested, Russia in a way is an ally of Iran, and we will have to fight this scenario. Last and the most problematic is disintegration of the whole system. The whole system, the nation state, because the Middle East in a way was crafted by Sykes-Picot 102 years ago in a very artificial way. And Iraq is divided to 3 areas. Syria is divided to 5 areas. And the whole system may collapse even to a worse situation than the last 7 years. So 4 scenarios. Let's work very hard on stabilization and maybe even start climbing from the real crisis that the Arab Spring have started.
One of the takeaways that I've had here is there's a lot of confusion around about the world we live in now. I think that Nick, I think back when we knew each other when you were in the 90s and you were at NATO, and we were living in this kind of post-Cold War world where the guardrails were firmly in place. We sort of knew what we were dealing with. And the guardrails don't seem to be there, at least when I sort of search for them intellectually, I kind of can't really grab them. And it seems to be a phenomenon that I think a lot of people in the world are facing now too. There's this sort of loss of commonality, sort of things that we used to have in common reference points that are no longer there. And it struck me that this, even though economically the world is doing so much better, this country and the U.S. doing so much better, there's a sort of creeping anxiety, and it comes out in this fascinating poll that Ipsos has done for this conference, that there's kind of rising expectation of some sort of global conflict going forward. Some people talk that we're sort of overdue for a cleansing war, and I wonder, of the panel, are we moving from a kind of post-war era to a pre-war era? And how likely do you think what are the odds of a really major conflict, and perhaps where is it most likely?
I guess I'd say that Putin understands that he is the weaker party in the standoff with NATO, and that's going to continue probably until the time he leaves and his Soviet-trained generation leaves office. I think the probability of war between NATO and Russia is quite low because of the resurgent strength of NATO and the self-confidence, and I have to credit Angela Merkel for that. I think she was the key leader after Crimea 2014 in facing down Putin. The sanctions have hurt Putin. The one that I think a lot of us worry about is the U.S.-China relationship, but it's broader than the U.S. It's the West and China. Japan's part of this, Canada's part of this, Europe's part of it. And we have to be very careful there because China's a self-confident society with a visionary leader. You may not agree with the vision, but if you read the speech that Xi Jinping gave 3.5 hours at the 19th Party Congress 13 months ago, that's a speech with strategic vision. And so we have to match it. And matching it would mean maintaining our military position. And that gets to the technological race that's ahead and the self-confidence that we have to have. And thinking of ourselves as part of a bigger movement, an alliance. Americans are so much stronger in our alliances than acting alone. I think President Trump doesn't get that. He doesn't agree with it, but most everybody else in our society does. And I worry that if we're so confrontational with China, it may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So strong enough to compete with them militarily to maintain our place and have deterrence in place, wise enough to see this extraordinary society as a partner of ours on climate change. And Barack Obama and Xi Jinping formed a joint venture on climate. We can do that kind of things, and the Canadians and Europeans have to be a big part of it.
You're an expert in war.
I think the good news is that chances of war are going down because of three issues. Don't forget the nuclear weapon and the MAD concept, mutual assured destruction. So I don't see China and the US going to war, that they will destroy each other. Second,
Could it be an unconventional war? Or, I mean, maybe we're thinking too conventionally here, yeah.
I'll come to it. Conventionally, you are about not to gain anything from war. The cost benefit of war is going down. And it has statistical evidence. Less and less people are killed in war in the last 40 years and the last 55 years than anywhere in history. So why? In the past, you go to war for very simple assets, for land, for gold, for slaves, for things that you can get from a war and pay basically nothing, or what you paid was hardly seen. You know, if the World War I, the casualties and the wounded people would have been seen on TV, the war wouldn't go for 5 years. And today, when every body bag is seen everywhere on social networks, the price of war is very high, and what you can achieve is very little. I don't know if you know, but America in 1848 took California from Mexico. There was a lot of benefit there. Gold, land, the Pacific coast, and the price was quite low, and nobody knows about it. Who want to go to war on California today? What is the wealth of California? It's Silicon Valley. If China will take Silicon Valley will disappear. So going to war, the motivation for big wars is not there. Last but not least, there are different kind of power exercising that are much more efficient than war. If it's a trade war, if it is an information war, look at the Russians. And it's not you. For the last 70 years, they tried to create some, to win over the United States. They were unable to do it with nuclear missiles, nuclear warhead, with submarines, with tanks, with airplanes. And then suddenly, in 2016, by another kind of war, the war on consciousness, the war of post-truth, the war of false facts, they were able to help elect an American president, which is not the popular vote and not maybe, and now, in a way, they are splitting America, they're continuing. Maybe America will be divided to the blue and the red. And this is Russian work. So they don't need to exercise their ballistic missiles with nuclear warhead. So I think wars will stay in a very low level, not of the superpowers, maybe places that are still haven't reached to understand that there are much more efficient way of exercising power and gain and advance your interest without the old kinetic war.
I want to, sorry.
Okay, I just want to add something. I remember this saying that says, fight till you drop. So you get to a point where you're tired of fighting, and you see that the fights have not given you what you're looking for. Then it's time to have a rethink. I think for Africa, most of our issues have been internal wars, basically. And in spite of the number of years that these wars have been fought, they really haven't gotten us to where we want to be. And what has happened is that the civil society in Africa has really gotten up and been very, very vocal, much more than they have been in the past. And so there's a demand for good governance. We wouldn't be talking about migration and all the other issues that other countries are suffering, quote, from Africa if we had good governance in most of the African countries. So the civil society has a very strong voice now, and the government also knows that they can't get away with how they have been governing. It cannot be business as usual. We're making more demands on accountability, where the civil society is making a lot of noise about corruption, is making a demand on good governance. I don't see things continuing the way they have been. And I think the basic African is really tired of those wars. The major war we have also been fighting is the war against terrorism. If you look at the whole of Africa, whether it's Mali or Chad or Congo or even Nigeria, we're dealing with Boko Haram for how many years? And every government that comes promises to deal with it as a campaign promise. And there's still a contention going on in that regard. And that's because there's corruption also involved. So, I think the answer is going to come from the citizens of Africa that are tired of bad governance and are making demands for change.
I want to open the... I want to bring in the audience, but let me first ask Vladimir about... Amos, you mentioned that the cost-benefit of war is that equation is changing. Yet there is a political benefit from a state of permanent war. And in some ways, Vladimir Putin is the best exemplar of it today. It's not hard to imagine even democratic leaders using war to...
He is the exception, by the way.
He is
the exception. And pay attention to the... Excuse me, Ken?
Sure.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Pay attention to the fact that he's playing a very weak cards, but very smartly. What he sent to the Middle East, not a huge military, 2 squadrons, couple of advisors, and little green man. That's it. It's cheap, and he achieved a lot, because the rules of engagement are totally different. He is bombing cities without lawyers that armies that I know, international lawyers that allow you to employ your Air Force, or he has no rules. And in such a way, he can achieve his goals.
But he's made the West into an enemy. There's a lot of politicians who also need enemies to survive, and they're not just authoritarian politicians. And I wonder...
So in the long run, he may also figure out that war has a cost that exceeds the benefits.
Is he coming to that point?
Well, of course, let's not forget that Vladimir Putin himself, as a political leader, is a product of war. He came to power on the back of the war in Chechnya, which he started as prime minister in the autumn of 1999, and his opinion poll ratings went from 2% to 52% in the space of a few months on the back of this relentless... Mostly it was a propaganda war. It was a very real war with many people dying, but on top of it was a relentless propaganda drumbeat every day, day in and day out, morning to evening, showing him as this kind of national strongman who's finally going to end this chaos and lawlessness, which of course only increased with many human casualties on top of it. But that's the original kind of birth point of the Putin regime, was a war. And then of course he used this many times throughout his rule, with Georgia, with Ukraine. And he has done this now in the last 3 years also with Syria. And let's not forget also that much of the motivation for these wars is a domestic one. For example, the point when he started the war in Ukraine, the spring of 2014, was the point when his approval fell back to the levels of 2011, which saw the biggest protest against his rule, with tens of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow in Bolotnaya Square and Sakharov Avenue. And so they were desperately looking for a distraction to throw out, and they found it in the war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. Now it stopped working, by the way. And if you look on Russian state television today and look at the so-called political talk shows, which I certainly advise you not to do if you value your nervous system, but if you decide to do this, you will see that there is much, much less both of Ukraine and Syria than there was even a
So the same youth that was supporting him 4 years ago is the same youth that's now in the streets protesting?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say the youth was necessarily supporting them. I mean, I remember vividly in 2014 when there was, this was within the space of a couple of weeks, I think this was October of 2014, there was a rally organized by pro-Putin groups on, I think it was on Vorobyova Gora, next to Moscow University, to kind of show support for his actions in eastern Ukraine, for what was happening, for the so-called people's rebellions in Donetsk and Lugansk. And if I'm correct, there were maybe 500-600 people who turned up to that, a pro-Kremlin rally in support of the war in Ukraine. That same month, or actually it was September of 2014, that same month, Boris Nemtsov, the Russian opposition leader, led a march through the streets of Moscow against the war with Ukraine. And I have to be honest, I remember that we were not sure what the turnout was going to be, because sometimes even those of us who like to think that we're not that susceptible to Putin's propaganda, when this is a daily drumbeat on you from morning to evening, every day, every week, every month, even some of us are beginning to have doubts. And of course the public image was that everybody supported Putin and everybody was for what he was doing in Ukraine. And I remember how shocked we were, in a very good way, when we saw just a massive sea of people who turned out to say no to that war. And the rally, it just didn't end for miles and miles and miles. And I remember this, so the rally route was from Pushkin Square down the Boulevard Ring to Sakharov Avenue, where it intersects with the Garden Ring. And when those of us in front had reached the end point, I remember somebody called back from Pushkin Square and said, you know what, there are people still lining up to go through metal detectors. And as far as the eye could see, it was just filled with faces. And so I think, again, we shouldn't take the Kremlin's propaganda image for real and not accept them at face value, because very often it's not.
Questions? I think just right here in the second row.
Thank you. My name is Jafet Omojua from Alpha Rich, Nigeria. How do we have a conversation on the next 10 years without discussing democracy and elections? Take, for instance, in the 90s, it was about government democratizing, you have to have elections. Now, a lot of governments are using democracy against their people.
Yeah.
They are subverting the Constitution. Even in the United States, things that we didn't used to see or hear about in Africa, about the US, voter suppression, which somebody said is a Western definition of vote rigging, that if it was an African country, they would have said vote rigging, not voter suppression. So can we have a conversation about the role of democracy, how democracy is evolving over the next 10 years, and the role of elections in actually in the empowerment of the people, so that, because more often than not, in a few African countries, for instance, people have removed term limits, people have changed the rules, everything to retain themselves in power. How do we redefine the rules of democracy and elections? Thank you.
Do you want to grab that?
Well, I'm in real agreement with you, and I did mention, I think one of the big battles we're going to be fighting in the next decade is the battle for democracy. And I've just spent a lot of time in Europe the last few months. If you think of Marine Le Pen in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, they are contesting. They're the anti-democratic right, contesting democracies. Orban's in control of Hungary. He's an autocrat. The Polish government's autocratic, and half the Italian government. The Salvini and the Liga are autocratic, and so the Europeans are fighting. We're fighting in our country. Our president assails the press, and he lies about the press. We had contested elections, especially in Georgia, where I think a very good case can be made for voter suppression of African-American voters by the Secretary of State who organized the elections is also running for governor of Georgia. So I think one of the challenges, if we're future-oriented for those of us in democratic societies, not just to believe in it, but to actually clean up our own systems and to make sure that our democracies are healthy. I think it's a challenge in our country that we have to struggle with as Americans, and certainly Europeans are struggling it. I must say, I'm not just trying to preach to the choir. We have a model democracy here in Canada. You have. We are watching you and taking some courage that democracies can succeed, that governance can be good, and that's a battle that needs exemplars, and Canada is one of them.
Quick.
Matt?
I think two questions. Oh.
Could I answer this as well?
Yeah, go ahead, Vladimir.
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's a very important issue you raised, and unfortunately it's really simple. A simple question as far as Russia is concerned. We don't have elections, and one of our major fights is to have the ability to freely elect our own government. We haven't had a free and fair election in our country for at least 18 years. And you don't need to take my word for it, just look at the reports from OSCE and Council of Europe observer missions that have documented and have been present in every single Russian election going back 2 decades or so. And the last time, and this is kind of considered the gold standard of election observation in Europe, both of those organizations, and the last time that they assessed Russian parliamentary and presidential elections respectively as free and fair was in 1999 and 2000. This is more than 18 years ago. So in the lifespan of a whole generation now, there hasn't been a free and fair election in Russia. And a very good example was earlier this year in March, which was again used by so many Western commentators to see, well, see how much Putin is popular among the Russian people. And you got something like 76%, that was the official result. Well, of course, the only small caveat to this is that there were two major opposition figures who were planning to run against Vladimir Putin in 2018. One was Boris Nemtsov, and the other was Alexei Navalny. And neither of them was able to. Boris Nemtsov, because 3 years before the election he was killed on a bridge in front of the Kremlin. And Alexei Navalny, because he was deliberately barred from running by a Russian criminal conviction that the European Court of Human Rights has ruled to be arbitrary. Now, you know, it's not difficult to win an election when your opponents are not on the ballot. It's not also a very good indicator of real popularity. So one of the major struggles, one of the major fights that we in the Russian opposition movement have today is to have elections, to have that right that so many people today around the world take for granted, the right to freely elect and then change your own government.
Question here and then here. We can group them together. And please feel free to offer your own predictions.
Yeah. Matt Horn, international lawyer, Washington, D.C. Exceptional conference. 10 years from now, I'll be 65. Thank you very much. Listening to all the comments and questions, what we heard throughout the event, public diplomacy, right? The UN needs to explain itself better. NATO needs to get more out to the citizens. We spend a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer money throughout the capitals on these issues. The OSCE, the French ambassador today, we don't know enough about the OSCE. I was the legal advisor in the 90s after the war in the Balkans, and people, thought I made it up because I needed a job when I got home. We talk about beating the narrative. The issue here is what seems to be going on throughout the world is we're losing the narrative, whether we can't explain to the public. People here forget with NATO after 9/11, the issue of national caveats and the debate that went on. And at the end of the day, what do we do to counter the narrative and for democracy to take back, for the West to prevail, for our values and ideology to counter the negativity and give voice to the voiceless and the oppressed? I mean, how do we take back the narrative? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just right here in the front.
Colonel Schilling, German MOD. Does any of you think that there might be the danger that the EU will split up in several parts, 2 or more, or that more members of the EU may leave the EU? And what would that impact on your analyzation of the broader picture? Thank you.
It's a very topical question with the chaos we're seeing out of London this weekend.
I don't have a Brit.
Who wants to sort of take either question on the improving the narrative or the future of the EU?
Well, there's nobody here who represents an EU country. I would just say after the experience of Britain, and look at Prime Minister May's perilous position in London, I think there'll be very few countries that try to lead the EU anytime soon. Although you have to worry about Italy and the fiscal situation there. As a North American, as an American, the EU is our friend, partner, not a strategic competitor, not a foe. And Americans have been consistent until this administration in thinking of the EU as our partner. I see the EU as going through an existential crisis of sorts with the Eurozone crisis, but fundamentally stable. And a lot will depend on your country. And Chancellor Merkel said she's not going to be chancellor after this term. You're next leader, because Germany's the engine. And I just say, on the other question, we need self-confidence in the West and leadership. And if one of the themes of Halifax is we need to talk to our publics about NATO and the EU, yes, we do. But in America, The recent polls suggest 65% of Americans support NATO. That's a very high number. It gives us confidence. But I think you're facing a self-confident Vladimir Putin, a self-confident Xi Jinping, MBS, too much self-confidence, obviously. We need that in the United States, and we don't have it right now. And we need a George H.W. Bush or a Ronald Reagan who will believe in our democratic system. I think that's what's coming in the States in our election of 2020. That's where the opposition is going to come from. More self-confidence about who we
Another
are.
Republican.
Could possibly be. Who knows? You know.
I just want to back up what Ambassador Burns said. I just flew in the day before yesterday from London. We had a few days of meetings and events in Parliament. And I came out of there with a very strong impression that so many people want to take that decision back, even those who backed it in 2016. So I think Ambassador Burns is absolutely right when he says that that was such a warning, what happened in Britain, not just to other EU member states, but to so many people in Britain itself. Of course, there's now increasingly mentions of a second referendum, and the members of Parliament from different sides with whom I met this past week are speaking increasingly about this as well as the possible only way out. So maybe even that's not final yet, the original Brexit. And I agree with you completely. I don't think that's going to be taken as a good example by other EU member states with all the chaos and everything that's followed in these last couple of years.
But this comes also to the issue of democracy in the contemporary democracy, which has two problems. And Churchill already said that democracy is not a perfect system. But it's become even more imperfect because we are going back to the Athens democracy, the town square. But the town square is today everybody. So the representative democracy, which in a way enabled democracies to be more stable and more responsible, is now going to the populace through the social network. And this is a danger to the democracy. The second danger is the killing of the truth tellers. Democracy can be strong if there are institutions that are telling the truth, that the voters, when they come to vote, know or have an idea what is right and what is wrong. And the attack on the truth tellers, which are the media on one hand, and which are the politicians, the approving rate of the Congress is 1 digit, isn't it? And the approval rate of other politicians is not that high as Putin has. So,
yeah, but that's real, though. There's a big difference in that.
So we have a problem that the representatives of the people that has to make a functional democracy is now under attack from both sides. And if we will not find a way how to strengthen the representative and the truth tellers, we will be in a disorder that will hurt democracy in a big way.
There's a relatively obscure French philosopher who said once that if democracy taken to hyperdrive becomes a spectacle and then becomes authoritarianism, and that seems to be at least what you're suggesting we might be moving towards. It's a question right here.
Thank you. Gabriel Guerra from Mexico. I'm a former diplomat and consultant. There are two topics I think have been left out of the discussion, and I would like to invite the panelists to maybe take them home with you. We may not have enough time, but they are corruption and organized crime and the impact that they are having all around the world, but especially in one part of the world that has been largely absent from discussion here, which is the south of our hemisphere. So if you look at Brazil, the 8th largest economy in the world, we have seen a subversion of democracy caused by voter discontent because of corruption. If you look at what the coup, the technical coup that ousted Dilma Rousseff and the election that led Mr. Bolsonaro to power, and if anybody doesn't know Mr. Bolsonaro, please just Google his quotes, and you'll have a hard time sleeping knowing that he's president of the 8th largest country in the world. That is a direct result of not being able to address corruption. Not being able to address organized crime has led to the factual collapse of 3 states in Central America: Salvador, Honduras, and to a lesser degree, Nicaragua. and has created the migratory mess that allowed President Trump to strengthen his hand during the latest campaign, with all this talk of the invasion that is not such. And it is also subverting Mexico, which is facing not only the challenge of organized crime, which has been severe and cost us 200,000 dead over the last 10 years, but migration through Mexico and the resentment it is causing. I am ashamed when I read about my own countrymen rejecting Central American migrants the way Trumpian supporters would in the US. But that is a phenomenon that subverts democracy and that sneaks in the back door. So maybe a little, I mean, I have no objection to discussing Russia, which I know well, but I think there's a backdoor enemy that we're not seeing here, and I would just like to invite you to reflect on that. Thank you.
That's a very good point. Maybe take one more question right here in front.
Thank you so much. I'm Leila Aliva. I'm based in Vienna at the moment, but originally from Baku, Azerbaijan. I have a question. Do you think that there is a tension, emerging tension between various levels and simultaneously developing levels of threats because of the, on the one hand, existence of nation states, where the, and also the populist leaders who try to utilize fear, which contributes to the traditional modern threats. And at the same time, you have this globalized community. Our study proved that in spite of the, even in such highly controlled societies, as in Azerbaijan, for instance, we have already emerging quite significant part of the young population who transcends the physical borders. They see themselves as part of the global community. And this is a new, newly emerging, and the similar division is in UK, for instance. David Goodhart, who divided Britain on two parts, somewheres versus anywheres. So these emerging sort of classes or groups, they create a new perception of threats. And of course, there are different approaches to threats regarding the migrants. One would say that the threat is the physical threat coming with refugees. The others would say is a reaction of the state to the threat, to the migrants, which is a threat to our values. So do you think that this multiplicity of understanding of threats, on the one hand, modern versus postmodern and pre-modern on the one hand, this type of uncertainty, and at the same time, the, yes, parallel coexistence is not resolved and in 10 years will be increasing?
Let me take one more question here in the front. The gentleman had one, and then we can probably wrap up.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. We've been looking at other areas, but I think Asia should be also giving a strong attention for this. Ambassador Byrne mentions about American-Chinese tensions. I think our Israeli speaker said there will be no war. But I would say the Chinese are willing to use force in pressing and pursuing their own national interests. In that sense, I am quite concerned about the future of Asia, in that sense. Dominance of China or dominance of US-Chinese relations would be a very important and serious issue in the future. Thank you.
Super. So we have actually three very interesting questions. I think one is about the Southern Hemisphere and the other forces. You mentioned corruption and governance. I could add demographics. You know, you're going to have fastest growing regions. Africa, we haven't mentioned India. That's not quite in the Southern Hemisphere, but I put it close enough. In a world where the rest of the world, where China and the Western world is getting older. I don't know if, Esther, you want to address that one.
Well, I think I don't think we have all the answers right now as we are. What I can say is probably what I see the world doing is taking it one at a time as it unfolds. Right now, there are so many problems in different parts of the world, And the purpose of this conference, I think it's, first of all, discussion and then preferring possible solutions. But we probably, my take on it is, you know, take it one day at a time as it unfolds.
Do you want to address that, or do you want to speak to the question about, you know, that you raised, that people don't, especially young people, as a new generation, doesn't think of the sort of the world the way that different generations have, sort of conventionally in nation-state terms, that maybe they identify with their generation or with different forces. I don't know, Nick, if you want to.
Can we end the conference on a note of hope?
Yes, please, absolutely.
Which was the first question. And I'll just say this, as someone from this hemisphere, we should be, I think, be hopeful about what can be accomplished in this hemisphere. If you think of Canada, the United States and Mexico, and Colombia and Peru and Chile and Argentina, you go right north-south, we're all successful market economies and democracies. We're all outward looking towards the Pacific. We're TPP countries, most of us, and I hope my country will rejoin it. Two big exceptions that we have to work on. One is Brazil. Is Bolsonaro going to govern as he campaigned? We hope not. But he has an opportunity to deregulate the economy, to try to boost the economy, but also try to heal Brazil after this horrific series of corruption scandals, the car scandals. That's the first. And the second, of course, is Central America. I never thought this caravan of people were a threat to the United States. I don't think we should have 6,000 American troops on the border, missing Thanksgiving because of a political stunt by our president. These people are women and children. They're poor people. They come out of fractured societies in Honduras and El Salvador, right, Nicaragua. We need North American and South American economic attention on these countries. Those are the two pockets, Brazil and Central America. But this should be a good, peaceful, economically productive 10 years for the people of our part of the world. So I wanted to offer that version of hope as we end the conference.
Thank you. I think we actually have to wrap up. So thank you to everyone. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Thanks very much, Matt. And there's a few people I just want to thank, and then I will dismiss the conference. I want to again thank our fellows for being with us and for past 3.5 weeks. We're really proud of you, and I want to take a moment to thank Paz, who led the fellowship, and Lior as well. Thanks very much, and we look forward to welcoming you back next year. I want to thank Juliana Gauss and her team for putting everything around together, all of the logistics and everything else, and making you all feel at home. That's Juliana and her team, so thanks, Juliana. I want to thank, I have to thank Robin Shepard, who stepped in for both Jonathan Tepperman and Gideon Rose. And I don't need to introduce him because you all know who he is because he was on stage all day yesterday. Robin Shepard. And I think it was Robin who actually called the movies that we do the icing on the cake. They're not the icing on the cake. They're actually a pillar of the forum. So I do want to introduce our filmmaker and thank him, Steve Markle, who's right here. Nancy, Bill, thanks very much, my board of directors. There's too many other people to thank, and I know you want to leave, but I want to thank all of you for coming, because we couldn't do this without you, and that is a truism. And I know many of you traveled a long distance, and many of you traveled a short distance, but it felt like a long distance. I know that Deer Lake has become a famous destination now because the Deputy Secretary General of NATO did an interview for the CBC from the tarmac there. So I'm very grateful to all of you who came this weekend. As many of you have remarked, this meeting is different. And this meeting is different. Why? Because democracies are better, and the people in this room are not afraid to say it. And so with that in mind, take that message, take it home to your communities, don't be afraid to say it, and we look forward to seeing you back this time next year, and have a safe trip home. Thanks very much, everybody.